The air in the grand halls of the Palacio de Belém, the official residence of the President of Portugal, often felt heavy with the silence of decades. In the spring of 1974, that silence was particularly thick, a quiet that seemed to hum with unspoken truths. Dust motes danced in the long shafts of sunlight, slicing through the tall, arched windows, illuminating polished wood floors and the stern, unsmiling portraits of men who had defined an era. This was the heart of the Estado Novo, the new state, a regime that had held a nation in its grip for nearly half a century. Its leader, the frail and distant Prime Minister, Marcelo Caetano, moved through these halls like a ghost, inheriting a legacy of authoritarian control from his predecessor, Antonio de Oliveira Salazar. He was a man steeped in the traditions of the past, yet he found himself presiding over a country that was increasingly restless, a nation simmering with frustrations that were no longer a secret. The very stones of the palace seemed to absorb the whispers of discontent from the city outside, a city that was a mix of faded grandeur and stark poverty. What happened when a nation, so long held in check by a powerful, unblinking state, finally decided to breathe? Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. So many of you listen in from all over the world, from the quiet cafes of Lisbon to the bustling streets of Tokyo, and it's always fascinating to see where everyone is tuning in from. Feel free to drop your location and local time in the comments below if you'd like. The story of the Carnation Revolution and the end of this long, quiet period is one of those legendary moments where history seems to hold its breath. It's a tale that begins not with a bang, but with a whimper, a long, slow decay of a system that had simply outlived its time. The Estado Novo regime was built on three main pillars: God, fatherland, and family. It was a conservative, corporatist state that aimed to preserve a romanticized, traditional Portugal free from the messy influences of democracy and communism. Antonio de Oliveira Salazar, a former economics professor, had seized control in 1932 and molded the country in his image. He centralized power, suppressed all opposition, and ran the economy with a strict, almost parsimonious hand. The secret police, known as the Pied, became a name whispered in hushed tones, its reach extending into every corner of Portuguese life. They were a shadowy, ever-present threat, responsible for surveillance, arrests, and the disappearance of anyone who dared to question the status quo. The Portuguese were, in many ways, living in a gilded cage. They were safe from the turmoil of a world at war, but they were also isolated from the freedoms and progress enjoyed by their European neighbors. Salazar, a man who believed in the moral superiority of his nation and its colonial empire, was the architect of this system. He saw Portugal's colonies in Africa, Angola, Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau, not as territories to be shed, but as integral parts of the Portuguese identity. This stubborn refusal to decolonize, at a time when other European powers were doing so, would prove to be the regime's ultimate undoing. The colonial wars, which began in the early 1960s, became a gaping wound, hemorrhaging money and lives. It was an endless, unwinnable conflict that sent a generation of young Portuguese men to fight in far-off jungles and savannas. The war, which was portrayed by the government as a noble defense of the nation's integrity was a brutal reality for the soldiers on the ground. They were fighting against independence movements that had the support of the local populations and increasingly international opinion. The cost, both human and economic, was staggering. Portugal, one of the poorest countries in Western Europe, was spending nearly half of its national budget on these wars, money that could have been used to build schools, hospitals, or roads. Instead, it was fueling a conflict that many young officers were beginning to see as futile and unjust. It was in the mud and blood of Africa that the seeds of a new Portugal were sown. The long, wearying years of fighting a war that seemed to have no end began to turn the hearts and minds of the very people the regime relied on for its survival, its military. They saw firsthand the human cost, the moral decay, and the sheer pointlessness of it all. This slow, quiet disillusionment would become the most powerful force in the country, more potent than any political party or intellectual movement. It was a force that was about to rise from the very soil that had been tilled by the regime itself. The men who would eventually lead the revolution were not radicals or firebrands, but professional soldiers, tired and ready for a change they felt was long overdue, and it was their quiet discontent, spreading like a rumor through the ranks, that would eventually bring the whole grand, dusty house of the Estado Novo tumbling down. The shadow of the Pied, the dreaded state security police, stretched across all of Portugal, a constant and chilling reminder of the regime's power. Its official name was the International and State Defense Police, but everyone knew it as something far more sinister. The PIDE was a master of surveillance, its network of informants reaching into every neighborhood, every cafe, and every workplace. Neighbors watched neighbors, and a careless word about the government could lead to a knock on the door in the dead of night. The fear was so ingrained that even in private homes, people spoke in whispers, their conversations carefully steered away from anything remotely political. This created a profound sense of isolation and mistrust among the Portuguese people, a feeling of being constantly watched and judged. The PID's tactics were not just about arrests, they were about psychological control, about creating an environment where dissent was not only punished, but almost unthinkable. The regime also tightly controlled all forms of media, from newspapers to radio, ensuring that the official narrative was the only one available. Stories about the colonial wars were sanitized, portraying them as a noble struggle against foreign-backed terrorists, not as the brutal, expensive, and ultimately unwinnable conflicts they were. The economy, too, was a tool of control. Salazar's austere, fiscally conservative policies had kept the country solvent, but they also stifled innovation and growth. While much of Western Europe was enjoying a post-war economic boom, Portugal remained largely agrarian and poor. The regime's corporatist system, which organized society into state-controlled unions and corporations, was designed to prevent class conflict and strikes, but in practice, it simply suppressed workers' rights and kept wages low. This led to a large-scale wave of emigration, with millions of Portuguese citizens leaving their homeland in search of better economic opportunities in countries like France, Germany, and Luxembourg. This exodus was a silent vote of no confidence in the regime, a powerful statement that people were willing to leave everything behind just to have a chance at a better life. The government, rather than seeing this as a sign of its own failure, often framed it as a natural, even patriotic movement of Portuguese people spreading their influence around the world. Of course, this was a bit like saying your house is doing great while all the residents are moving out. While the Estado Novo maintained this facade of a calm, traditional nation, the reality was a slow-burning fuse. The younger generation, especially those who had gone to university or served in the military, were becoming increasingly aware of Portugal's isolation and backwardness. They listened to foreign radio stations, read books smuggled from abroad, and saw with their own eyes the disparity between their lives and those of their European counterparts. The colonial wars were a particularly potent catalyst for this change. For the young officers fighting in Africa, the disconnect between the official propaganda and the brutal reality of the battlefield became impossible to ignore. They were sent to fight for an empire that was already crumbling, and they saw their comrades die for a cause they no longer believed in. This shared experience of disillusionment forged a powerful bond among these junior officers, a bond that transcended rank and region. They began to meet in secret, in officers' clubs, and in quiet homes, to talk not just about the war, but about the very nature of the regime that had sent them there. They questioned the endless cycle of violence, the lack of political freedom, and the economic stagnation that was holding their country back. This was the quiet, almost invisible birth of a revolution. It wasn't born in the fiery speeches of political dissidents, but in the weary, cynical conversations of soldiers who had seen too much. Historians still argue whether the colonial wars were the sole cause of the revolution, or merely the final, decisive blow to a regime that was already rotting from within. But there is no doubt they were a fundamental catalyst. The cost of the wars, both in lives and in resources, was simply unsustainable, and it created a level of discontent that even the PIDE couldn't contain. The military, once the bulwark of the regime, was slowly but surely becoming its greatest threat. The very soldiers who were supposed to defend the Estado Novo were the ones who would ultimately tear it down. The colonial wars, which had been going on for more than a decade by the early 1970s, were a slow and painful drain on Portugal. The war machine demanded a relentless supply of men and materiel, and the national budget was stretched to its breaking point. Every year, thousands of young men were conscripted and sent to fight in Angola, Mozambique, and Guinea-Bissau, a mandatory service that lasted up to 4 years. For many of them, it was their first time leaving their quiet villages and small towns. They were thrust into a brutal, foreign landscape where the enemy was often indistinguishable from the civilian population. The psychological toll of this type of guerrilla warfare was immense, leading to a profound sense of futility among the soldiers. They questioned why they were fighting to hold on to territories that seemed determined to be free, and they began to see the contradictions in the regime's patriotic rhetoric. They were fighting for a concept of empire that no longer existed, a ghost of a glorious past that was a far cry from the swampy, dangerous reality of the present. The economic strain was equally severe. Portugal was one of the poorest countries in Western Europe, and the military spending was a massive dead weight on its struggling economy. The lack of investment in education, infrastructure, and industry meant the country fell further behind its neighbors. The government's solution was often to borrow more, creating a cycle of debt that seemed to have no end. This economic stagnation, combined with the human cost of the wars, created a deep well of resentment. While the government continued to broadcast propaganda about the nobility of the cause, the reality for most Portuguese families was a struggle to make ends meet. They were sending their sons off to fight for a cause they didn't understand, and those who returned were often scarred, both physically and psychologically. The government's attempts to hide the true cost of the wars were becoming less and less effective as more and more families received letters detailing the death or injury of a loved one. The public mood was slowly shifting from one of quiet resignation to one of open frustration. It was within the officer corps itself that this frustration began to coalesce into a powerful, organized force. The colonial wars were particularly demoralizing for the junior and mid-level officers, the captains and majors who were on the front lines, leading the fighting. They were often better educated than their superiors, and they had a clearer understanding of the strategic hopelessness of the conflict. Many had been to university, where they had been exposed to new ideas about democracy and self-determination. They had also seen the corruption and incompetence of the high command. The promotions system was based more on loyalty than on merit, and they felt their efforts and sacrifices were being ignored. This led to a simmering resentment against the senior generals, who were seen as out of touch and unwilling to face the reality of the situation. This growing sense of professional and moral grievance was the glue that held the group together. They felt they had a duty to their country, but they also believed that the current government was betraying that duty. The officers started meeting in secret, first to discuss their professional grievances, and then, as their trust in one another grew, to discuss the political situation. These early meetings were informal, often taking place in discreet locations like back rooms of cafes or in quiet private homes. They were a mix of Army, Navy, and Air Force officers, a rare cross-branch collaboration that spoke to the depth of their shared discontent. These men, who would later be known as the Captains of April, were not career politicians or seasoned revolutionaries. They were soldiers who had been pushed to their breaking point. They felt a sense of responsibility to save their country, and they saw a revolution as the only way to do it. The fact that the military, the very institution that had long been the backbone of the authoritarian regime, was now becoming its most dangerous enemy was a delicious kind of irony. A moment when the very pillars of a house were preparing to collapse it from within. It was in these quiet, clandestine meetings that the idea for a coup was born, not out of a lust for power, but out of a desperate desire for peace and change. They knew the risks were immense, that a single leak to the Pi Dal-E could mean imprisonment, torture, or even death. But the alternative, the endless, bloody colonial wars, was a price they were no longer willing to pay. The growing discontent within the military found a formal name in 1973, the Movimento das Forças Armadas, or the MFA. This organization was not a typical revolutionary cell with a clear, charismatic leader. Instead, It was a decentralized network of junior and mid-level officers, many of them captains, who shared a common frustration with the colonial wars and the regime they were fighting for. The MFA's origins were surprisingly mundane. The initial meetings were simply gatherings to discuss professional grievances, such as a decree that changed the promotion structure, making it harder for reserve officers to advance. This seemingly minor issue was the spark that ignited a much larger fire, as these professional conversations quickly morphed into political ones. The officers realized they had a shared interest in bringing an end to the colonial wars, and by extension, the government that perpetuated them. The MFA was structured to be secretive and resilient. There was no single, obvious head, which made it difficult for the PIDE to infiltrate and dismantle. Instead, it was organized into small, clandestine cells that communicated through coded messages and secret meetings. They were soldiers, after all, and they applied a military-like discipline to their conspiracy. They used code names, employed discreet couriers, and often met in obscure locations, far from the watchful eyes of the state. One of their most famous meeting places was a secluded farm near the town of Évora, where they could talk openly without fear of being overheard. The officers came from all branches of the military, the Army, the Navy, and the Air Force, and this cross-pollination of ideas and resources made the movement incredibly strong. The core group was united by a shared sense of moral duty. They saw the colonial wars as not only unwinnable, but also profoundly unjust, and they believed that they, as the guardians of the nation, had a responsibility to end them. The MFA's political ideology was a blend of different ideas, reflecting the diverse backgrounds of its members. Some were more left-leaning and socialist, while others were more moderate and liberal. What united them was not a single political platform, but a shared set of goals: to end the colonial wars, to overthrow the Estado Novo, and to establish a democratic government in Portugal. They were not seeking to install a military dictatorship. On the contrary, their ultimate goal was to return power to the people and allow them to choose their own leaders. This distinction was crucial, as it set the Carnation Revolution apart from so many other military coups throughout history. It was a revolution led by soldiers who wanted to get out of politics, not get into it. The months leading up to the coup were a time of intense, quiet preparation. The MFA began to draft a manifesto, a document that would outline their goals and their vision for a new Portugal. They planned the military operation with meticulous detail, identifying key strategic points in Lisbon to occupy, and assigning specific units to each task. They also knew that a successful revolution would require not just military action, but also the support of the public. They had to convince the Portuguese people that this was not just another power grab, but a genuine movement for change. This is where their planning moved from the purely military to the psychological. They needed a way to signal their intentions, to announce the start of the revolution in a way that would be heard by everyone in the country, but understood only by those who were in on the plan. This is where the story gets a bit like a spy novel, with its secret codes and its reliance on a seemingly harmless medium. A good conspirator knows that the most effective disguise is often the one that's hiding in plain sight. They were about to turn two popular songs, two pieces of music that were played on the radio every day, into the first notes of a revolution. This was their final, perfect signal, a message that would travel through the airwaves, unnoticed by the old regime, but eagerly awaited by the new one. The meticulous planning of the MFA extended far beyond the simple organization of military units. They understood that a sudden movement of troops might trigger a reaction from the Pied or Loyalist forces. They needed a signal, a secret code that would activate the operation without arousing suspicion. This is where the story of the Carnation Revolution takes on a slightly romantic, almost cinematic quality. The conspirators, with their lives and the future of their country on the line, turned to something so innocuous, so deeply woven into the fabric of everyday life that no one would ever suspect it. Music. The plan was simple but elegant. Two specific songs, both popular and played on Portuguese radio, would serve as the final, crucial go-ahead. The first, E Depois do Adeus, and After the Goodbye, was a sentimental ballad performed by Paulo de Carvalho that had been Portugal's entry in the 1974 Eurovision Song Contest. This song was the initial trigger. When it was broadcast on a specific time on a specific radio station, it would be the green light for the MFA units to begin their preparations and move into position. It was a signal that said, "The game is on, get ready." The choice of a Eurovision song was pure genius. It was a song that many Portuguese people had heard, and it was the kind of music that could be playing in a cafe or a living room without raising a single eyebrow. It was a perfect piece of camouflage. The second song was the final signal, the one that meant the coup was officially underway. This was Grandola, Vila Morena, Grandola, Swarthy Town, a song by the folk singer José Afonso. This one was different. It was a song of solidarity, a gentle and poetic piece about the people of a town in southern Portugal. The lyrics spoke of friendship and equality, and it had become a quiet anthem for a generation of students and intellectuals who yearned for a different kind of country. The government had banned Afonso's music, so this song was rarely heard on the radio. Hearing it would be an unmistakable sign to the conspirators that the time had come. Its broadcast on Radio Renascença, a Catholic radio station known for its independence, was the definitive signal. It told the units in position to proceed with their operations and occupy their assigned targets. The contrast between the two songs was also a kind of message in itself. The sentimental ballad to get things started, and the quiet, revolutionary folk song to begin the action. It was a revolution that started not with a military march, but with a song of the people. The use of these two songs was a calculated risk that paid off beautifully. It was a way to communicate across a vast network of conspirators, many of whom were stationed in different parts of the country, without sending a single piece of written communication that could be intercepted. It was a perfect blend of modern technology and classic conspiratorial cunning. The PIDE, for all its power and its network of informants, was completely outfoxed. They were looking for coded messages, secret documents, and clandestine meetings, but they never thought to look for the signal hidden in plain sight, in the soundtrack of everyday Portuguese life. It was a reminder that sometimes the most powerful acts of defiance are the ones that are quiet and clever rather than loud and brash. The conspirators knew that the key to their success was speed and surprise. The moment the second song was broadcast, they had to move, and they had to move quickly. The fate of their country rested on the timing of a single piece of music. It's almost funny to think that a government that had spent decades controlling and censoring everything in its path was undone by a couple of songs on the radio. It really is a testament to the fact that you can't control everything, especially when a good melody is involved. The moment of truth arrived on the night of April 24th, 1974. The air in Lisbon was cool and quiet, a gentle spring night like any other. The streets were largely deserted, and the city was lulled into a false sense of security. But beneath the surface, an extraordinary event was beginning to unfold. At exactly 10:55 p.m., the first song, E Depois do Adeus, played on the radio station Emissor Associados de Lisboa. It was a mundane, almost forgettable moment for most of Portugal, but for the members of the MFA, it was the sound of a starting gun. In barracks and clandestine meeting points across the country, the conspirators listened intently. The sound of the song was a signal to begin their final preparations. Soldiers who were in on the plan began to quietly rouse their comrades, preparing their vehicles and equipment for the march on Lisbon. It was a nervous, tense period, but also one of grim determination. They knew that a single misstep, a single betrayal, could lead to the failure of the entire operation and the brutal consequences that would follow. The mood was a mixture of professional calm and palpable fear. They were about to risk everything, their careers, their freedom, their very lives, for a cause they believed was just. The second, more definitive signal came just after midnight. At 12:20 a.m. on April 25th, the forbidden song, Grandola Vila Morena, was broadcast on Radio Renascença. The song's simple, powerful lyrics about a fraternal town rang out across the airwaves. This was the final, unmistakable sign. The revolution was officially underway. The military units that had been waiting in position began to move. They were not a massive, overwhelming force, but they were well organized and decisive. A column of troops from the Army School of Cavalry, led by Captain Salgueiro Maia, was one of the first to set out. Their target was the Terreiro do Paço, the central square in Lisbon and the seat of government power. The initial movements were carried out with a surprising degree of peace and order. The soldiers moved through the dark streets of the city, their armored cars and jeeps, a strange and surreal sight. There was no gunfire, no explosions, and no panic. It was an almost silent invasion of the capital. The PD, the all-seeing secret police, seemed to be completely caught off guard. They had been looking for a grand, dramatic plot, but they had missed the quiet, methodical planning that had been going on right under their noses. Their intelligence network, for all its vaunted power, had failed to pick up on the most important piece of information of all. The element of surprise was the MFA's greatest weapon, and they had used it with perfect precision. This quiet beginning was a perfect foreshadowing of what was to come, a revolution that would defy all the expectations of what a revolution was supposed to be. It was less of a violent storm and more of a soft, steady rain that simply washed the old regime away. It was a moment that could have gone terribly wrong, but instead, it went almost unbelievably right, a testament to the meticulous planning and shared purpose of the young officers who were about to change the course of Portuguese history forever. With the signals received and the plans in motion, the MFA's forces began their quiet, determined march into the heart of Lisbon. The initial moments of the coup were a masterpiece of strategic surprise and disciplined action. The first objective was to secure key strategic points in the capital. Units from the Army School of Practical Cavalry, under the command of Captain Salgueiro Maia, rolled into Lisbon with a column of armored cars and trucks. Their primary target was the Praça do Comércio, also known as Terreiro do Paço, the vast waterfront square that housed the Ministry of Finance and the central government buildings. Another group of officers and troops headed for the airport, the radio stations, and the headquarters of the PID, the secret police. The soldiers moved with an almost surreal calm. The streets were empty in the pre-dawn hours of Thursday, April 25th, 1974, and the clatter of the armored vehicles was one of the few sounds breaking the silence. There was no resistance. The handful of police officers who saw the advancing columns seemed to be caught completely off guard, unsure of what they were witnessing. This lack of opposition was a testament to how well the MFA had kept their plans a secret and to how widespread the disillusionment within the military had become. Many of the soldiers and officers who were not part of the MFA's inner circle were simply following orders from their captains and majors, a chain of command that had been quietly subverted from the bottom up. A loyalist general at the Ministry of Defense did receive a report about the troop movements, but he dismissed it as a minor training exercise, a blunder that would become a footnote in history. The MFA's control of the city was established with surprising speed. By 4 a.m., Salgueiro Maia's column had successfully occupied the Praça do Comércio. They positioned their vehicles in a semicircle, effectively sealing off the square. Other units had secured the airport and the national radio and television stations. The first official announcement came just after 4 a.m. The military station, Radio Clube Português, broadcast the first MFA communique, a short and formal message that declared the military had taken control of the country and that the population should remain calm and stay in their homes. It was a message that was met with a mix of confusion, shock, and cautious hope. People had been conditioned for so long to fear any mention of political change that the news seemed almost unbelievable. The MFA's communication was a key part of their strategy. They wanted to show that this was not a bloody power grab, but a peaceful transition. They kept emphasizing the need for calm and the importance of avoiding violence. In a stroke of luck, a group of journalists who were friendly to the cause were able to get on the air and begin broadcasting more detailed information. One of the most important moments came when Captain Otelo Saraiva de Carvalho, one of the masterminds of the coup, spoke on the radio, explaining the MFA's goals. He said that the military was not interested in power, but in restoring democracy and ending the colonial wars. This was a crucial message, and it began to reassure the public that this was something different. The initial movements of the coup were a testament to the fact that sometimes The quietest actions it can have the biggest consequences, a beautiful contrast to the long, noisy wars that had brought them to this point. As the sun began to rise on April 25th, 1974, a strange and peaceful spectacle unfolded across Lisbon. The city, which had gone to sleep under a dictatorship, was waking up to the sight of tanks and soldiers in the streets. For many, the initial reaction was not one of fear, but of confusion and intense curiosity. People who had been told to stay in their homes by the military's first radio communiques slowly began to emerge. They cautiously approached the soldiers, who were standing guard in front of government buildings and strategic locations. What they found was not the stern, menacing presence of an occupying force, but something entirely different. The soldiers, many of them young men in their early 20s, were not wearing helmets or carrying their weapons at the ready. They had a relaxed, almost friendly demeanor. They engaged in conversation with the civilians, who quickly realized that this was not a coup d'etat in the traditional sense, a violent power grab by a new group of strongmen. This was a revolution with a different kind of spirit. The soldiers explained that they were there to end the colonial wars and bring democracy to Portugal. The public, who had been so long suppressed and silenced, began to feel a cautious surge of hope. The transformation of the atmosphere was quick and profound. Civilians, initially hesitant, started to bring food and drink to the soldiers. The most iconic and powerful moment of the day, however, was still to come. It was around midday when a flower vendor named Celeste Cairo, who was walking through the streets with her unsold stock of red carnations, was asked by a soldier for something to put in the barrel of his rifle. She didn't have anything else to give, so she offered him a carnation. The soldier accepted, and with this small, simple gesture, a new symbol was born. Other soldiers followed suit, and soon red carnations were being placed in the barrels of their guns and pinned to their uniforms by the jubilant crowd. The act was a powerful, silent statement. It was a rejection of violence and a symbol of peace, an unarmed response to armed men that perfectly captured the spirit of the day. The image of a gun barrel with a delicate flower sticking out of it became the defining image of the Carnation Revolution, and it was broadcast around the world. It showed that a country could overthrow a decades-old dictatorship with a minimal amount of bloodshed. The name of the revolution itself became a testament to this incredible moment. It wasn't the gun revolution or the tank revolution, but the Carnation Revolution, a name that forever links the day's events to the peaceful nature of its execution. The fact that the soldiers were so willing to accept the carnations from the people demonstrated that they were not an enemy to be feared, but a part of the nation that had finally had enough. This was not a revolution of us versus them, but a moment when the soldiers and the civilians united as one. It was a beautiful, almost unbelievable turn of events, a moment when the entire country seemed to collectively exhale a sigh of relief. The iconic image of red carnations in the barrels of soldiers' rifles was not just a symbolic gesture, it was a powerful reflection of the almost miraculous lack of violence on that historic day. While most revolutions are marked by bloodshed, street fighting, and a high casualty count, the Carnation Revolution was a stunning exception. The MFA had planned for a peaceful transition, and the public's immediate and overwhelming support for the soldiers helped ensure their goal was met. The atmosphere in Lisbon was festive and joyous, more like a street party than a coup. People sang, danced, and cheered in the streets, celebrating a freedom they had been denied for so long. The most intense moment of the day came when the forces of Captain Salgueiro Maia, who had secured the Praça do Comércio, confronted the Prime Minister, Marcelo Caetano. After realizing that his government had lost control, Caetano had taken refuge in the GNR, National Republican Guard barracks, in the Carmo barracks. Surrounded by tanks and a determined and now sizable group of civilians and soldiers, Caetano was trapped. Salgueiro Maia and his men had a clear opportunity to storm the barracks and take Caetano by force, but they chose a different, more peaceful path. Maia was a firm believer in the MFA's commitment to avoiding bloodshed. He was also a practical soldier who understood that a violent confrontation could lead to a domino effect of chaos and resistance. He began a series of negotiations with the officers loyal to Caetano inside the barracks. The negotiations were tense and lengthy. Caetano was still a man of the old regime, and he held a final, desperate card. He refused to surrender to the MFA, whom he saw as a group of rebellious junior officers. Instead, he insisted that he would only hand over power to a general, someone who held a higher rank, and who could ensure that the transition would be orderly. This was a classic moment of bureaucratic stubbornness, even in the face of a full-blown revolution. Salgueiro Maia, a pragmatic man, agreed to the terms. He radioed MFA headquarters and requested that General Antonio de Spinola, a respected figure in the military who had recently been dismissed for his opposition to the colonial wars, be sent to accept the surrender. Spinola's recent book, which argued that the colonial wars could not be won by military means, had made him a popular figure, and his involvement lent legitimacy to the MFA's cause. Spinola arrived at the Carmo barracks later in the day. He was a perfect choice for the role, a man of high rank and reputation who was also sympathetic to the goals of the revolution. Caetano met with Spinola and formally surrendered his government. The negotiation was carried out with a strange mix of formality and revolution. Caetano insisted that the surrender be a dignified transfer of power to a general, not a messy overthrow by a popular uprising. It was his last, quiet attempt to maintain a sense of order and propriety for a regime that was crumbling all around him. The fact that the MFA agreed to this request showed their commitment to a peaceful transition and their understanding of the need to win over the old guard. The bloodless nature of the transfer was an incredible accomplishment, a testament to the patience and wisdom of the MFA's leaders. The surrender of Caetano was the final, formal act that brought the Estado Novo to its knees. With the surrender of Prime Minister Caetano, the final chapter of the Estado Novo regime was written. In a strange, almost theatrical climax, Caetano was placed inside a military armored vehicle and driven to the airport. The vehicle was draped in the red and green Portuguese flag, a small gesture of respect from his captors that was also a clear signal that the old order was gone. From the airport, Caetano and two of his ministers, who had surrendered with him, were flown to the island of Madeira. This was not a punitive imprisonment, but a dignified exile. From Madeira, they would later travel to Brazil, where Caetano would live out the rest of his life. The quiet departure of the regime's leaders was a final, fitting end to a revolution that had been defined by its peacefulness. There were no public trials, no summary executions, and no parades of captured officials. The new government and the Portuguese people seemed to prefer a clean, soft break with the past. The immediate aftermath was a euphoric explosion of freedom. The streets of Lisbon remained full of people celebrating, cheering on the soldiers, and dancing to music that had been banned just hours before. The long-suppressed political prisoners were released from the notorious Caxias and Peniche prisons. Their release was an incredibly emotional moment, as they were greeted by jubilant crowds who had waited for decades for this very moment. The PD, the secret police that had held the nation in a vice-like grip, was immediately dismantled. The PIDE's headquarters were quickly surrounded by angry mobs, but the military was able to prevent any serious violence. The dismantling of the PIDEs was a crucial first step toward a democratic society. It removed the institutionalized fear that had permeated every aspect of Portuguese life. The end of this long, dark chapter was met with a collective sigh of relief and a sense of possibility that had been absent for nearly 50 years. In the hours and days that followed, a new provisional government was established. The MFA, as the force that had initiated the revolution, was at the center of this new political reality. They formed the Council of National Salvation, a military junta that was meant to be a temporary governing body. The council was led by General Antonio de Spinola, who, with his reputation and his role in accepting Caetano's surrender, had become a pivotal figure and the de facto face of the revolution. The MFA's manifesto, which had been broadcast on the radio, became the foundational document for this new government. Its goals were clear and simple: to bring an end to the colonial wars, to hold free elections, to establish democratic freedoms, and to hold negotiations for a new constitution. The transition from a dictatorship to a democracy was not going to be easy, and the challenges were immense. The country was economically backward, politically inexperienced, and still entangled in the messy business of decolonization. But on that first day, none of that seemed to matter. The joy and the hope were palpable. The people of Portugal, who had been told for so long that they were not ready for democracy, had just shown the world that they could achieve profound change with a grace and peace that was almost unbelievable. It was a revolution that proved that sometimes the quietest actions and the most determined minds can do more to change the world than all the noise and violence of a traditional war. The quiet exile of the old leaders and the jubilant release of the prisoners were two sides of the same coin, a peaceful end and a hopeful beginning. In the immediate aftermath of the Carnation Revolution, the Movimento das Forças Armadas, MFA, found itself in an extraordinary position. The captains and majors, who had quietly plotted in secret, were now the heroes of the nation. They were seen as the saviors who had ended the long, draining colonial wars and toppled a decades-old dictatorship. Figures like Otelo Saraiva de Carvalho, one of the coup's chief architects, and Vasco Gonçalves, a politically astute and left-leaning officer, emerged as the most prominent faces of this new era. These men, once anonymous soldiers, were suddenly national celebrities, their faces plastered on newspapers and their names spoken with reverence. They had the trust and support of the Portuguese people, and they had the power to shape the future of their country. But while the victory was celebrated, the reality of governing a country that had been politically dormant for 48 years was a colossal challenge. The new provisional government, led by General Spinola as president, was a mix of military officers and civilian politicians. The MFA, as a collective body, continued to hold significant sway, particularly through its governing council. Their first and most pressing order of business was to fulfill the promises they had made in their manifesto. The most critical of these was to end the colonial wars. The long, drawn-out conflicts in Africa had been the primary catalyst for the revolution, and the MFA knew they had to act quickly to decolonize and bring the troops home. This was not a simple task. The sudden withdrawal of Portugal from its colonies led to a complex and often chaotic process of decolonization. Angola, Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau, Cape Verde, and São Tomé and Príncipe would all gain their independence in the coming months, a seismic shift that would create new nations, but also new problems, including civil wars and mass migrations of Portuguese settlers back to Portugal. The political awakening of the Portuguese people was a stunning spectacle. After decades of being silenced, the nation erupted in a vibrant, almost dizzying display of political activity. Political parties that had been banned for nearly half a century suddenly re-emerged from the shadows. The Portuguese Communist Party, PCP, for example, had operated in secrecy for decades, its members often facing imprisonment or worse. With the revolution, they came out into the open, their influence and organization making them a powerful force. New parties, from the left to the right, also began to form, all vying for the hearts and minds of the newly liberated electorate. The streets of Lisbon, which had been so quiet on the night of the coup, were now alive with political rallies, public debates, and impassioned speeches. It was as if the entire country was having a conversation it had been desperate to have for a very long time. This sudden rush of freedom, however, came with its own set of challenges. The political spectrum was wide and varied, and the different factions had very different ideas about what a new Portugal should look like. The MFA itself was not a monolithic entity. Within its ranks, there were a variety of ideological positions, from moderate democratic socialists to more radical communists. This ideological divide within the military, combined with the new and sometimes chaotic political landscape, would lead to a period of intense struggle and instability. For a time, it seemed as though the peaceful Carnation Revolution might be followed by a much less peaceful period of internal conflict. This tension was particularly apparent in the relationship between the more moderate military leaders, like Spinola, and the more revolutionary and left-leaning MFA officers, like Otelo Saraiva de Carvalho. They had all been united in their desire to end the dictatorship, but now that the dictatorship was gone, they had to figure out what to build in its place. Historians still argue whether this post-revolutionary period was a necessary phase of political maturation or a dangerous flirtation with chaos, but one thing is certain: Portugal had to learn how to walk on its own 2 feet, and it had to do it very, very quickly. The sudden and swift dismantling of the Estado Novo regime was just the beginning of Portugal's journey. Now, the country had to grapple with the immense task of decolonization, a complex and often messy process that was a direct and necessary consequence of the revolution. The MFA's core promise had been to end the colonial wars, which meant granting independence to the African territories, Angola, Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau, Cape Verde, and São Tomé and Príncipe. For a long time, the Portuguese had been taught that these colonies were not foreign possessions, but an integral part of the nation itself. The revolution shattered this long-held belief. The decolonization process was chaotic and fraught with challenges. In many of the colonies, long-simmering independence movements, which had been fighting against Portuguese rule for years, now found themselves in a race to fill the power vacuum left by the departing colonial authorities. The sudden withdrawal of Portuguese troops and administrators left many of these nations with little in the way of stable governance or infrastructure. The result was often internal conflict, with rival factions fighting for control. Historians still debate whether the speed of the decolonization was a necessary evil to end the wars, or an irresponsible act that led to greater instability in the former colonies. The MFA, in its desire to quickly fulfill its promises, might have moved too fast for the good of the African nations, but a slow process would have risked a return to war and a backlash at home. For Portugal, the consequences of this rapid decolonization were immense. Hundreds of thousands of Portuguese settlers, known as returnees, began to flee the newly independent African nations. Many of them had lived in Africa for generations and now faced the prospect of losing everything. They arrived in Portugal with little more than the clothes on their backs, creating a massive refugee crisis for a country that was already one of the poorest in Western Europe. The government had to scramble to provide housing, jobs, and social support for these new arrivals, a task that was made even more difficult by the fact that many of the retornados had a higher standard of living than most of the native Portuguese population. The influx of so many people at once placed a huge strain on the country's limited resources and social services. At the same time, the end of the colonial wars meant that more than 100,000 soldiers returned home. These were young men who had spent years fighting in a brutal war and were now faced with the challenge of reintegrating into civilian life. Many of them were disillusioned and scarred, and they came back to a country that was completely different from the one they had left. The government had to deal with the challenge of providing them with jobs and support, a task that was complicated by the economic turmoil that followed the revolution. The colonial empire, which had been a source of national pride and economic opportunity for some, was gone forever. Portugal was now a small European nation, forced to confront a new reality. The country's identity was fundamentally reshaped, and it had to find a new place for itself in the world. It was a painful and difficult transition, but it was also a necessary one. The end of the empire was the price of freedom and democracy, and while it came with a heavy cost, it was a price that most Portuguese were more than willing to pay. The joyous, peaceful revolution of April 25th was a beautiful beginning, but it was followed by a much more turbulent and complex period known as the Hot Summer of 1975. The months following the initial coup were a time of intense political and ideological struggle as the various factions within the new government and the country at large vied for control of Portugal's future. The MFA, which had been a unified force against the dictatorship, now fractured along ideological lines. There were moderates who wanted a stable, Western-style democracy, and there were radicals who wanted a more profound social and economic revolution, often inspired by communist and socialist ideals. This ideological divide was a direct result of the long-suppressed political forces suddenly being unleashed. The political struggle was not just happening in the halls of government, it was happening on the streets. Factory workers began to seize control of their workplaces, and landless peasants occupied large estates in the south of the country, turning them into collective farms. The Portuguese Communist Party, PCP, which had been highly organized and disciplined for decades in its underground existence, was particularly effective at mobilizing these movements. They had the support of influential figures within the MFA, most notably Prime Minister Vasco Gonçalves, a left-leaning officer who believed in a more radical restructuring of Portuguese society. The PCP's growing influence alarmed the more moderate and conservative elements in Portugal, including a significant portion of the Catholic Church and the business community. They feared that the country was heading toward a Soviet-style communist state. This period of intense political struggle was also marked by a series of failed coups and counter-coups, which added to the instability. The most notable of these was the attempt by General Spinola, the first provisional president, to stage a right-wing coup in September 1974. He had grown increasingly concerned about the rise of the left and the radical direction he saw the country heading in. The attempt, however, was a total failure. It was quickly and decisively put down by the MFA's more radical wing, which used the opportunity to consolidate its power. Spinola was forced into exile in Brazil, and the more left-leaning faction of the MFA gained a temporary upper hand. This shift in power worried many in Western Europe and the United States, who feared that Portugal might become the first communist country in Western Europe. It was a period of high stakes and high tension, a veritable political roller coaster that had everyone on edge. The media, now completely free from censorship, was a battleground for these ideological conflicts. Newspapers and radio stations were seized by various factions, each one broadcasting its own version of the truth. It was a confusing and disorienting time for the average Portuguese citizen who was suddenly faced with a deluge of information and a bewildering array of political choices. The Carnation Revolution had been a beautiful and simple act of change, but the path to a stable democracy was proving to be much more difficult. It was a period where the promises of April 25th were tested and tried, and it was unclear whether the country would ultimately succeed in its transition. The hot summer was a powerful reminder that while it might be easy to tear down an old house, it's much harder to agree on a plan to build a new one. The period following the Carnation Revolution was a high-stakes ideological battle, a clash between the forces of the moderate center and the radical left. On one side stood the Portuguese Socialist Party, PSP, led by the charismatic and pragmatic Mario Soares. Soares and his party advocated for a Western European-style social democracy with a focus on civil liberties, a market-based economy, and a strong relationship with the European community. They had strong support from the more liberal elements of the MFA and the urban middle class. On the other side was the Portuguese Communist Party, PCP, which was highly disciplined and well organized, with a powerful network of unions and grassroots support. The PCP, along with its allies in the radical wing of the MFA, led by figures like Prime Minister Vasco Gonçalves, pushed for a much more profound social and economic revolution. They advocated for land reform, nationalization of industries, and a society based on Marxist principles. This clash of ideologies wasn't just a theoretical debate. It was a real and tangible struggle for control of the country. The MFA, as the de facto ruling power, was deeply divided. The more radical faction saw itself as the vanguard of a true socialist revolution. They were suspicious of traditional political parties and feared that a return to a liberal democracy would simply lead to a new form of class oppression. The moderates within the MFA, however, believed that their primary duty was to restore a multi-party democracy and then step back from power, fulfilling the original promise of the revolution. This internal conflict created a state of constant tension and instability. The ideological struggle was played out in the media and in the streets. Radio stations and newspapers were occupied by different political factions, each one broadcasting its own version of events. There were frequent political rallies, protests, and counter-protests, and a general sense of unease and uncertainty hung over the country. The economy was in a state of chaos, with land seizures and factory occupations causing a significant disruption in production and a wave of capital flight. The influx of the retornados from the African colonies added another layer of social and economic stress. The conflict reached a head in the summer of 1975 when the left-leaning Prime Minister Vasco Gonçalves' government was brought down by a wave of protests and a loss of support within the MFA itself. The moderates within the military and the Socialist Party saw this as a moment to push back against the radical tide. They believed that the country had to choose a more stable, democratic path or risk descending into civil war. The fear of a communist takeover was real and widespread, and it galvanized the moderate forces. The struggle between the left and the right was a test of the Carnation Revolution's peaceful spirit. Could a country that had toppled a dictatorship so gracefully now navigate the treacherous waters of a fundamental ideological struggle without resorting to violence? The fate of Portugal hung in the balance, and the question was about to be answered in a final, decisive moment that would determine whether the revolution would lead to a stable democracy or a new form of political extremism. The ideological conflict that had been simmering throughout 1975 finally reached a breaking point, bringing Portugal to the brink of a new kind of crisis. The hot summer had seen the country lurching between different political agendas, with the moderate forces fearing a communist takeover and the radical left pushing for a full-scale socialist revolution. This tension culminated in a pivotal moment known as the 25th of November crisis. The stage was set when the radical wing of the MFA, a group of officers who believed the revolution was being betrayed by the moderates made a last-ditch attempt to seize power. In the early morning hours of November 25th, 1975, a group of far-left paratroopers, supported by radical elements of the MFA and the Communist Party, attempted to stage a coup. They occupied several Air Force bases and radio stations, aiming to oust the moderate government and install a more radical, left-leaning one. For a few tense hours, it seemed as if the peaceful spirit of the Carnation Revolution might finally be broken. The country held its breath, wondering if this was the moment when the political tensions would finally explode into widespread violence. However, the moderates within the military, led by a new generation of officers, including Antonio Ramalho Eanes, who would later become president, were prepared. They had spent months organizing a counterforce to deal with just such a scenario. Eanes was a professional soldier who believed in a disciplined, non-political military and a return to civilian rule. He swiftly mobilized loyalist forces to put down the rebellion. The troops under his command were given a clear order: put down the coup without bloodshed. They surrounded the rebel-held air bases and radio stations, and after a series of tense standoffs and negotiations, the rebels surrendered. The coup attempt was a complete failure, and it was put down with remarkably little violence, a testament to the continued commitment to the peaceful principles of April 25th. The failure of the November 25th coup was a definitive turning point for the Carnation Revolution. It effectively ended the period of radical left-wing influence and solidified the power of the moderates. The MFA, which had been the central political force since the revolution, was now effectively sidelined. The military, having proven that it could put its own house in order, decided to step back from politics and allow the civilian government to take over. This moment marked the end of the hot summer and the beginning of a more stable, democratic transition. The country had, in a sense, stared into the abyss of political extremism and had pulled back just in time. The crisis, while scary, had a positive outcome. It cleared the air and made it clear that the vast majority of the Portuguese people and their military wanted a stable, multi-party democracy, not a radical one. The crisis had effectively ended the dream of a socialist revolution led by the military and paved the way for the next crucial step: free elections. With the failure of the November 25th coup, the path was finally clear for the next and most crucial step in Portugal's democratic transition: a free and fair general election. For the first time in nearly 50 years, the Portuguese people would have the opportunity to choose their own leaders. The date was set for April 25th, 1976, exactly 2 years after the Carnation Revolution, a poetic and powerful choice that connected the act of liberation with the act of self-governance. The campaign period was about a whirlwind of activity, a stark contrast to the political silence of the Estado Novo era. Political parties, from the left to the right, held rallies, debated on television, and tried to win over an electorate that was largely new to the idea of democratic politics. The Socialist Party, led by Mário Soares, campaigned on a platform of moderate social change and integration with Europe, while the Communist Party, PCP, continued to advocate for more radical reforms. The election results, were a powerful statement about the will of the Portuguese people. The Socialist Party won the largest share of the votes, but without a majority. The centrist and conservative parties also performed well, while the Communist Party, despite its high profile during the hot summer, received a smaller share of the vote than many had expected, the outcome was a clear signal that the Portuguese people had rejected the extremes of both the far left and the far right. They had chosen a path of moderation, a path toward a stable, multi-party democracy. It was a remarkable moment, a testament to the fact that a population that had been silenced for so long was more than capable of making a wise and well-considered political choice. The peaceful transfer of power from a military junta to a democratically elected civilian government was a final and definitive fulfillment of the original promise of the Carnation Revolution. The election of 1976 marked the end of the military's direct political control. The MFA, which had been the central political force for 2 years, now willingly stepped back from power. The officers, who had been the heroes of the revolution, now retreated to their barracks, allowing the newly elected politicians to govern. This was a crucial moment for the country. It showed that the military was committed to its promise of restoring civilian rule and that it had no desire to become a new form of dictatorship. The transition was not always smooth. There were still lingering tensions and occasional flare-ups between the different ideological factions, but the outcome of the election and the military's subsequent retreat solidified the democratic framework. The election was a celebration of freedom, a moment when the Portuguese people could finally, and without fear, use their voices to shape their own destiny. It was a powerful and quiet reminder that democracy is not given, but must be chosen. With the first free elections successfully held, and the military having stepped back from direct rule, the focus of the revolution shifted from a military operation to a political and legal one. The newly elected Constituent Assembly, a body whose sole purpose was to draft a new constitution, began its work. This was a monumental task. The assembly was composed of representatives from all the major political parties, and they were tasked with creating a document that would not only define the structure of the new democratic state, but also enshrine the fundamental freedoms and rights that had been absent for so long. The process of drafting the Constitution was, as you might expect, a reflection of the intense political debates that had defined the post-revolutionary period. The Socialist Party and the Communist Party, though they had been at odds, found common ground in their desire to include strong social and economic rights in the new document. The more conservative parties pushed for a constitution that was more aligned with Western European models, with a greater emphasis on individual liberties and a market economy. The final document was a compromise, a blend of different ideologies that created a unique and progressive framework for Portuguese democracy. The new constitution, which was approved in 1936, was a remarkable document. It declared Portugal a sovereign republic based on the dignity of the human person and the will of the people. It included a long list of fundamental rights and freedoms, including freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and the right to form political parties and unions. It also had a more unique feature. It enshrined the principles of the Carnation Revolution itself, declaring that the country was in a transition towards socialism While this specific clause was later revised, its inclusion was a powerful testament to the influence of the radical left-wing elements that had been so prominent in the early days of the revolution. The Constitution also established a new system of government with a powerful president and a prime minister who would lead the government. It was a careful balancing act designed to prevent the concentration of power in a single person or institution and to ensure a system of checks and balances. The Constitution was more than just a legal document. It was a symbol of the revolution's success. It showed that the country could overcome its political divisions and create a unified legal framework for a democratic future. It was a final, definitive rejection of the dictatorship and a full-throated embrace of a new, free Portugal. The process of drafting and approving the Constitution was a long and arduous one, but its successful completion was a powerful sign that the country was finally on the path to a stable, peaceful, and democratic future. It was a victory not just for the politicians, but for the entire Portuguese people who had endured so much and had finally earned their right to self-governance. With the new constitution in place and a democratically elected government at the helm, Portugal began the long and arduous process of rebuilding itself. The revolutionary fervor of the hot summer had faded, replaced by the sober and challenging work of governance. The country was still a poor and largely agrarian nation, and the new government faced a daunting list of problems. The economy was in shambles, crippled by the disruptions of the revolution and the mass departure of capital and skilled workers. The sudden influx of hundreds of thousands of retornados from the former colonies placed an enormous strain on the country's social services and job market. The government, led by the pragmatic and determined socialist leader Mario Soares, had to find a way to stabilize the economy and create a more equitable society. One of the most important goals of the new government was to integrate Portugal into Europe. The Estado Novo regime had kept the country isolated from its neighbors, but now the new government saw a future in a closer relationship with the European Economic Community, EEC, the precursor to the European Union. Membership in the EEC would provide access to a massive market for Portuguese goods, as well as much-needed financial assistance for infrastructure and development projects. It was a clear signal that Portugal was turning away from its colonial past and toward a new European future. The application for membership was a long and complex process, but it was a central pillar of the new government's foreign policy. The post-revolutionary era was also a time of significant social and cultural change. The long-suppressed freedoms of expression and thought were now celebrated. Art, music, and literature, which had been censored for decades, flourished in this new environment. The country had a chance to catch up with the rest of Europe, culturally and socially. This was a particularly exciting time for the younger generation, who had grown up under the shadow of the dictatorship. They were now free to explore new ideas, to travel, and to engage in a political and cultural dialogue that had been completely forbidden to their parents' generation. The revolution, in a sense, gave them back their youth. While the path forward was clear, it was not always easy. The new government had to navigate a complex political landscape with a vibrant and sometimes contentious parliament. Strikes and protests which had been illegal under the old regime, were now a regular part of political life. The new democracy was a loud, messy, and sometimes inefficient thing, but it was a far cry from the quiet, repressive silence of the dictatorship. Historians still argue whether the transition could have been less turbulent, but there is no doubt that the Portuguese people had to find their footing in a new, free country. This period, from the end of the revolution to the first years of stable democracy, was a time of immense growth and change, a difficult but necessary chapter in the story of a nation finding its way back to itself. The end of the empire and the beginning of a European identity were two sides of the same coin, a difficult but necessary exchange that would shape the country's destiny for generations to come. In the years that followed the revolution, Portugal had to face the difficult task of reconciling with its past. The transition from a dictatorship that had lasted for nearly half a century to a young, fragile democracy was not easy, and it brought with it a host of new questions. What would be the fate of those who had served the old regime? How would the country remember its history of repression and colonial rule? These were not just abstract, political questions. They were deeply personal ones that touched every family in the country. The new government, in a display of remarkable restraint, chose a path of reconciliation over retribution. There were no mass purges or show trials of former regime members. Instead, a legal process was put in place to deal with those who had committed crimes during the dictatorship, particularly members of the PIDE, the secret police. While many PIDE agents were arrested, many more were allowed to simply fade into obscurity. This decision, to avoid a vengeful settling of scores, was a key part of the peaceful transition. It allowed the country to move forward without being bogged down by a long and bitter period of internal conflict. At the same time, the country had to grapple with the collective memory of the long Estado Novo era. The government and civil society began to create a new narrative, one that celebrated the revolution as a moment of national liberation and a triumph of democracy. The day of the revolution, April 25th, was declared a national holiday, and monuments and museums were created to commemorate the event. This official memory, however, was not always a perfect reflection of the country's complicated past. There were still many who felt a sense of nostalgia for the stability and order of the old regime, even if they acknowledged its flaws. The legacy of the colonial wars, in particular, was a painful and complex part of the national memory. The country had to come to terms with the fact that its long history of empire was over, and that it had to forge a new identity as a small European nation. Historians still argue about whether the country has fully and adequately grappled with this legacy, or if it has simply been glossed over in the name of a peaceful transition. The new government, led by Prime Minister Soares and the Socialist Party, also had to find a way to heal the deep ideological wounds of the hot summer. The political climate remained tense for a number of years, but the establishment of a stable, multi-party democracy and the move toward European integration helped to calm the waters. The more radical elements of the left were slowly marginalized, and the more conservative parties began to gain a stronger foothold in the political landscape. The Portuguese people having seen the dangers of political extremism, seemed to be settling into a more moderate and pragmatic approach to politics. The country was, in a sense, growing up. It was learning that democracy was not a perfect system, but it was a far better one than the quiet, repressive silence of the past. The process of reconciliation, of looking back and then moving forward, was a difficult but necessary one, and it was a crucial chapter in the story of a nation finding its way back to itself. The peaceful and successful nature of the Carnation Revolution resonated far beyond Portugal's borders. It was a powerful and inspiring example for other nations struggling under authoritarian rule. In a world that had become accustomed to violent revolutions and coups, the story of a dictatorship being toppled with a single act of defiance, placing a flower in a gun barrel, was a message of hope. It showed that profound political change was possible without widespread bloodshed. This message was particularly potent in countries that were still grappling with their own authoritarian regimes, whether in Eastern Europe, Latin America, or Africa. The revolution provided a tangible model for a peaceful transition to democracy. The revolution also had a significant impact on international relations. Portugal, once a pariah state due to its colonial wars and its authoritarian government, was now a celebrated member of the democratic club. The Western European powers, who had been cautious about their relationship with the Estado Novo, now embraced the new democratic Portugal. The country's commitment to decolonization, while often messy and chaotic, was seen as a major step forward, and it helped to mend Portugal's relationship with its African neighbors and the broader international community. Portugal's application to join the European Economic Community, EEC, which was a central goal of the new government, was now met with enthusiasm. The country's successful transition to democracy was seen as a prerequisite for its membership, and the EEC's members were eager to welcome a new, democratic partner. The revolution transformed Portugal's foreign policy from one of isolation and defiance to one of integration and cooperation. The legacy of the Carnation Revolution is, in many ways, a testament to the power of a single, simple idea. The idea that a nation could choose peace over violence, and that a people could demand freedom and get it. The Carnation, which had been a symbol of a quiet revolution, became a global icon for peaceful change. It showed that a revolution did not have to be a grand, violent event, but could be a quiet, graceful act of defiance. Historians still debate whether the peacefulness of the revolution was a product of the unique circumstances in Portugal at the time, or if it provides a universal lesson for other movements. Regardless, the story of the Carnation Revolution became a part of the global lexicon of freedom and democracy, a quiet whisper that reminded the world that change is always possible and that sometimes all it takes is a flower. The years that followed the revolution were a time of consolidation and institutionalization. The political and social upheaval of the hot summer had been a baptism by fire for Portugal's young democracy, and it had ultimately strengthened the country's resolve to build a stable and lasting system. The military, having put down the radical coup on November 25, 1975, had effectively ended its political role. This was a crucial step. The military returned to the barracks, and the civilian government, now with a clear mandate from the people, was free to govern without the constant threat of military interference. This marked the definitive end of the MFA's direct political power and the beginning of a true multi-party democracy. The fact that the military, the very institution that had started the revolution, willingly gave up power was a rare and powerful example of political maturity. The newly elected government, led by Prime Minister Mario Soares, began the difficult work of economic and social reform. The country was still a long way from the prosperity of its European neighbors, and the government had to navigate a complex set of challenges. One of the first tasks was to reverse some of the more radical policies of the post-revolutionary period, such as the nationalization of private companies. The government began a process of privatization and worked to attract foreign investment. At the same time, it maintained many of the social gains of the revolution, such as the right to strike and the establishment of a robust social security system. The new government's approach was a pragmatic one, a blend of socialist ideals and market-based policies that would become a hallmark of Portuguese democracy. Another key part of this period was the slow and steady process of preparing the country for entry into the European Economic Community, EEC. This was a massive undertaking that required a fundamental restructuring of the Portuguese economy, legal system, and social policies to meet the high standards of the EEC. The government had to negotiate for years, and the process was not without its critics. Many in Portugal feared that joining the EEC would mean a loss of national sovereignty, and that Portuguese industry would not be able to compete with its more advanced European counterparts. However, the government saw it as the only viable path to a prosperous and stable future. The goal of European integration became a central, unifying theme for the country, a new national project to replace the lost empire. The period from 1976 to the early 1980s was one of gradual progress. The political climate calmed down, the economy began to stabilize, and the country's democratic institutions became more deeply rooted. The early years of democracy were not without their challenges. There were still protests and political crises, but the country never returned to the brink of chaos that had defined the hot summer. The people of Portugal, who had been patient for so long, were now learning the ins and outs of a democratic system with all its messiness and its freedoms. They had chosen a different path from the one that had been forced upon them for nearly half a century, and they were determined to make it work. The peaceful revolution had been a first step, but the hard, day-to-day work of building a new country was just beginning. It was a quieter, less dramatic period than the revolution itself, but in many ways, it was just as important. The peaceful and transformative nature of the Carnation Revolution served as a powerful source of inspiration for democratic movements around the globe. In a world still dominated by military coups and authoritarian regimes, Portugal's gentle transition showed that a different path was possible. The image of the carnations in the gun barrels became a global symbol of nonviolent resistance and a powerful antidote to the grim reality of armed conflict. This imagery resonated with people in other countries who were fighting for their own freedoms. It showed that soldiers could be liberators, not just oppressors, and that the will of the people, when expressed peacefully and with determination, could overcome even the most entrenched of powers. This was particularly true in other parts of the world that were dealing with their own dictatorships. In Spain, for example, the death of General Francisco Franco in 1975 opened the door to its own democratic transition, and the Portuguese model provided a clear and peaceful template for how a country could move from an authoritarian past to a democratic future. The Spanish transition, though unique in its own right, was undoubtedly influenced by the successful and relatively calm events that had unfolded in its neighboring country. Similarly, in Latin America, where military juntas were still common, the Carnation Revolution provided a hopeful example of a country that had successfully broken free from military rule. The peaceful nature of the revolution was a constant source of inspiration, a reminder that the path to freedom did not always have to be soaked in the blood. The revolution also had a ripple effect in international diplomacy. Portugal, once an isolated pariah state, was now a respected member of the international community. Its commitment to democracy and its willingness to decolonize, however messy, helped to mend its relationships with former allies and enemies alike. It was now a partner, not a problem. The revolution's influence also extended into academic and political circles. Scholars and political scientists began to study the Carnation Revolution as a unique case study in political transition. They were fascinated by how a country with no prior democratic experience could make such a peaceful and successful leap. The theories of how a country could transition from authoritarianism to democracy had to be rewritten in light of the Portuguese experience. The revolution became a new kind of model, one that emphasized the importance of a professional, disciplined military and a strong, peaceful civil society. The fact that the military, as a whole, had no desire to cling to power was seen as a critical factor. The Portuguese had stumbled upon a new kind of revolution, one that was gentle and inclusive, not violent and exclusive. It was a powerful reminder that history is not just a series of battles and wars, but also a quiet unfolding of events that can change the world in the most unexpected of ways. The symbolic power of the Carnation remains a central part of the revolution's legacy. It is the single most recognizable image of the events of April 25th, and it stands as a permanent reminder of the peaceful nature of the transition. The flower, which had been placed in the gun barrels by jubilant civilians, became a powerful statement that the people of Portugal desired change without bloodshed. This was not a revolution of force against force, but of hope against fear. The choice of the Carnation was spontaneous, a perfect moment of improvisation that perfectly captured the spirit of the day. It was a symbol that spoke 1,000 words, a quiet statement that a new era was beginning. The Carnation came to represent the democratic values of freedom, peace, and nonviolence, and it became a source of national pride. The fact that the revolution took its name from a flower rather than from a battle or a military leader is a testament to the unique and gentle nature of the event. The symbol of the Carnation has also been used to commemorate the revolution and to teach new generations about its importance. On April 25th, the national holiday of Freedom Day, people in Portugal wear red carnations on their lapels, and they place them in public squares and monuments. The flower has become a part of the national identity, a reminder that the country's freedom was won not through violence, but through a quiet, determined will for change. The image of the carnation is also used in education, in textbooks, and in museums to teach children about the importance of democracy and the power of nonviolent action. Historians still argue whether the symbolism of the carnation has overshadowed the more complex and messy parts of the revolution's history, but there is no doubt that it has helped to create a powerful and unifying national myth. The carnation is a reminder that even in the most difficult of times, a gentle and peaceful spirit can prevail. The legacy of the carnation is not just a Portuguese one. It has also been adopted by democratic movements around the world. The image of a flower in a gun barrel is a universal symbol of peaceful protest and defiance. It has been used by activists and protesters in other countries to symbolize their own nonviolent struggles for freedom and democracy. It shows that a single image, born of a moment of spontaneity, can have a lasting and global impact. The carnation, in a sense, became a gift from the Portuguese people to the rest of the world, a reminder that the fight for freedom does not always have to be a violent one. It is a symbol that has inspired countless people to stand up for their rights, and it is a powerful testament to the power of a single, simple act. The carnation, more than any other symbol, embodies the enduring legacy of the revolution. The enduring legacy of the Carnation Revolution is a powerful and complex one, a tapestry woven with threads of triumph, challenge, and quiet determination. It fundamentally and forever changed Portugal, transforming it from a closed authoritarian state into a vibrant modern democracy. This was not a simple change. It was a complete overhaul of the country's political, social, and economic fabric. The most obvious and immediate legacy was the establishment of a democratic political system with free elections, a new constitution, and a multi-party parliament. This was a profound shift from the single-party, non-democratic rule of the Estado Novo. It gave the Portuguese people a voice and a choice, something they had not had in nearly 50 years. The new political system, despite its initial turbulence, proved to be remarkably resilient. It survived coups, political crises, and economic downturns, and it ultimately became a stable and lasting part of Portuguese society. The revolution's legacy also includes a fundamental redefinition of Portugal's national identity. The country had, for centuries, defined itself as a colonial power with a global empire. The revolution brought this era to a close and forced the country to confront a new reality, that it was a small European nation. This transition was painful and difficult, but it was also a necessary step toward a more modern and prosperous future. The end of the empire allowed Portugal to focus on its own development and to forge a new identity as a member of the European community. The successful integration into the European Union, which occurred in 1986, was a direct result of the revolution's promise of democracy and European alignment. This membership brought with it a wave of economic investment and social development that helped to transform the country. On a social and cultural level, the revolution's legacy is immense. It was a moment of profound liberation. Censorship was abolished, and a vibrant and diverse cultural scene emerged. Art, Music and literature, which had been suppressed for so long, now flourished. The people were free to read, to listen, and to create without fear of reprisal. The revolution also brought about significant social reforms, including the legalization of divorce and the establishment of a more progressive and equitable social security system. While historians still debate whether the revolution's more radical promises of social equality were fully realized, there is no doubt that it led to a more open and tolerant society. The country, once so closed and conservative, had now embraced a new way of life. The revolution's most powerful and enduring legacy, however, is the very spirit in which it was conducted. It stands as a testament to the power of peaceful change and the quiet determination of a people who had had enough. The image of the carnation in the gun barrel is a constant reminder that freedom can be won without violence. It is a message that resonates with every new generation and a source of national pride. The revolution's legacy is not just a story of politics and power. It is a story of a nation finding its soul and choosing a better path. It is a story that continues to inspire and to remind us that even in the darkest of times, hope and a little bit of floral defiance can triumph. The commemoration of the Carnation Revolution is a vital part of modern Portuguese life, a way for the country to remember its past and celebrate its present freedoms. The day itself, April 25th, is a national holiday known as Dia da Liberdade, or Freedom Day. It is a day of reflection and celebration, a moment when the country pauses to honor the soldiers and civilians who helped bring about the end of the dictatorship. Across the country, there are official ceremonies, concerts, and public events. The most significant of these is often a parade in Lisbon, where military vehicles and tanks that were used in the revolution are driven through the streets, not as symbols of power or aggression, but as a reminder of how they were used to bring peace and freedom. It is a powerful and moving sight, a visual representation of the country's unique history. The symbolic actions of that day are still very much a part of the commemoration. Many Portuguese people wear red carnations on their lapels on April 25th, a simple but profound gesture that connects them to the spirit of the revolution. The songs that were used as signals, E Depois do Adeus and Grândola, Vila Morena, are played on the radio, and they have become unofficial anthems of the revolution. Schools teach about the events of April 25th, and museums, such as the Museu do Aljube Resistência e Liberdade in Lisbon, are dedicated to telling the story of the dictatorship and the struggle for freedom. Those institutions serve a crucial role in ensuring that the memory of the Estado Novo and the courage of those who fought against it are not forgotten. The act of commemorating the revolution is not just about looking back. It is also about looking forward. The celebrations are often used as a platform to discuss the challenges facing modern democracy and to reaffirm the country's commitment to the values of freedom and justice. The holiday is a reminder that democracy is not a given, but something that must be constantly defended and nurtured. For a country that had no prior experience with democracy, this act of remembrance is a way of grounding its political system in a shared historical experience. It helps to create a sense of continuity and a collective understanding of what it means to be a Portuguese citizen in the post-revolutionary era. The commemoration of the revolution is also a way for Portugal to showcase its unique path to democracy to the rest of the world. It is a proud and powerful story, and the country is more than happy to share it. On April 25th, reporters and camera crews from all over the world descend on Lisbon to cover the events, and the story of the Carnation Revolution is told again and again. It is a testament to the fact that a single day and a single simple act of placing a flower in a gun barrel can have a lasting and global impact. The commemoration of April 25th is a beautiful and important part of the national calendar, a day that celebrates not just a historical event, but a core part of the country's identity. The peaceful transition to democracy after the Carnation Revolution was a remarkable achievement, but it was not without its lingering shadows. The country had to figure out what to do with the physical and institutional remnants of the Estado Novo. The dismantling of the PID, the secret police, was a top priority. But what about the prisons they had run? What about the vast archives of information they had collected on citizens? The prisons, such as the infamous Peniche Fortress and Caxias, which had held political prisoners for decades, were transformed into museums and memorials. They now serve as powerful reminders of the repression of the past and the importance of freedom. The act of turning a place of suffering into a place of remembrance was a crucial part of the healing process. It allowed the country to confront its past in a constructive way and to ensure that such a chapter of history would never be repeated. The archives of the PIDE were also a source of immense controversy. There were debates about whether they should be opened to the public to allow people to see who had spied on them and who had betrayed their friends and neighbors. Ultimately, the archives were opened, and they became a key resource for historians and a way for families to find out what had happened to their loved ones. The revolution's legacy also includes a new way of thinking about the military. Under the Estado Novo, the military was an instrument of the state, used to enforce authoritarian rule and to fight colonial wars. The revolution, which was initiated by the military itself, fundamentally changed this relationship. The military, which had been the enforcer of the dictatorship, was now seen as the liberator of the nation. But after the hot summer of 1975, the military voluntarily stepped back from politics and returned to its traditional role as the protector of the nation. This was a crucial step toward building a stable, democratic state. Historians still argue whether the MFA's initial flirtation with power was a necessary evil to ensure the transition to democracy, or if it was a dangerous moment that almost derailed the entire revolution. The military's decision to step back, however, cemented its new role as a professional, non-political force, and it became a crucial pillar of the new democratic order. The military had, in a sense, redeemed itself in the eyes of the nation. The process of reconciliation with the past was a slow and often difficult one. It involved not just official acts of government, but also a private, personal reckoning for millions of Portuguese people. Families had to confront their own roles, whether large or small, in the old regime. It was a time of both forgiveness and reckoning, a moment when the country had to look at its own reflection and decide what kind of nation it wanted to be. The peaceful nature of the revolution allowed this process to unfold without the bitterness and vengefulness that often accompanies such profound changes. The country had chosen a path of quiet grace over loud confrontation, and in the end, it was a path that worked. The peaceful nature of the Carnation Revolution was not just a happy accident. It was a testament to a deep-seated desire for change without bloodshed, a longing that was deeply rooted in the collective consciousness of the Portuguese people. This commitment to nonviolence set the revolution apart from many others and gave it a moral authority that continues to resonate today. The revolution's peaceful success had a profound impact on other movements for democracy around the world. In the years that followed, as the Soviet Union's grip on Eastern Europe began to loosen, countries like Czechoslovakia, Poland, and East Germany looked to the Portuguese example. The Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia, in particular, was seen as a direct heir to the Carnation Revolution. It showed that a people could peacefully and successfully dismantle a one-party state without resorting to armed conflict. The success of these movements, in turn, reinforced the power of nonviolent resistance and helped to shift the global paradigm of how revolutions were conducted. The Portuguese example also served as a beacon of hope for democratic movements in Latin America and Asia, where authoritarian regimes were still a brutal reality. It showed that even in the most entrenched dictatorships, the will of the people could not be suppressed forever. The impact of the Carnation Revolution on international relations was equally significant. Portugal's shift from an isolated authoritarian state to a democratic European partner fundamentally changed its place in the world. The country's newfound commitment to democracy and its willingness to decolonize were met with open arms by the international community. Portugal joined the United Nations in 1955, but under the Estado Novo, it was often seen as a rogue state due to its stubborn refusal to decolonize. The revolution changed all of that. Portugal became a respected member of international organizations and a reliable ally to its democratic partners. The country's commitment to European integration was a key part of this new foreign policy. The prospect of joining the European Economic Community, EEC, provided a powerful incentive for the new government to stabilize the country and to align its laws and policies with those of Western Europe. The successful transition to democracy was a prerequisite for membership, and the country worked tirelessly to meet the standards required. This alignment with Europe was a fundamental break from the old colonial past and a powerful signal that Portugal was ready to forge a new identity as a European nation. The story of the Carnation Revolution is, in many ways, a perfect example of how a single event can have a ripple effect that changes the world. It showed that a people could choose a different path and that a quiet, determined spirit could triumph over a repressive, authoritarian state. The revolution's legacy is not just a Portuguese one, it is a global one, a powerful and inspiring story that continues to remind us that freedom and democracy are always possible and that sometimes all it takes is a flower. The peaceful and definitive end of the Estado Novo regime was in many ways the result of a gradual and almost invisible shift in the country's collective psyche. The long, wearying colonial wars had slowly chipped away at the national pride and the sense of purpose that had once defined the regime. The constant flow of bad news from Africa, the rising casualty lists, and the economic strain all contributed to a pervasive sense of futility. This was a war that the Portuguese people, and particularly the young soldiers fighting it, simply no longer believed in. The revolution, in this sense, was not a sudden explosion, but a quiet, inevitable climax to a long period of decay. The regime had lost its will to fight and its moral authority. The political prisoners, the censorship, and the powerful secret police had all failed to contain the rising tide of discontent. When the moment came and the MFA moved, the old regime simply crumbled. There were no loyalists willing to fight for a system that had long since lost its way. The success of the Carnation Revolution was also due to the unique nature of its leaders. The captains and majors of the MFA were not a group of ambitious, power-hungry politicians. They were soldiers who had seen the brutal realities of war and had come to believe that the only way to save their country was to get out of it. Their primary goal was not to install a new military dictatorship, but to restore democracy and civilian rule. This was a crucial difference that set the Portuguese Revolution apart from so many others. The MFA's commitment to a peaceful transition and to a return to civilian rule was a cornerstone of their success. They had a clear and simple message, and it resonated with the Portuguese people. The MFA, in a sense, was a temporary force for good, a transitional government that was willing to put its own interests aside for the good of the nation. This was a powerful and inspiring example of selflessness. The legacy of the Carnation Revolution is also about a lesson in the power of collective action. The revolution was not the result of a single hero or a single act of defiance. It was the result of a widespread sense of disillusionment and a quiet, determined will for change. The soldiers who joined the MFA, the civilians who put carnations in their gun barrels, and the politicians who came to power after the coup all played a part in this story. It was a collective effort, a moment when the entire country came together to say, "Enough." The revolution's success showed that a people, when they are united and determined, can achieve the impossible. The revolution, in this sense, was a triumph of the human spirit, a testament to the fact that freedom and democracy are not just abstract ideas, but something that can be won, and won peacefully. The country had, in a sense, a long-delayed awakening, and it was a beautiful and peaceful one. The commemoration of the Carnation Revolution is a vital part of Portugal's national calendar, a day that is both a celebration of freedom and a solemn remembrance of the past. Every year on April 25th, the country comes together to honor the soldiers and civilians who made the peaceful transition to democracy possible. The main celebrations take place in Lisbon, where the military parades through the streets, not as a show of force, but as a symbol of the people's liberation. The tanks and armored cars that were used in the coup are now a part of a joyous procession, a powerful reversal of their traditional role. It is a moment that perfectly captures the unique spirit of the revolution, a testament to the fact that power can be used for peace, not just for war. The symbolic act of placing carnations in the gun barrels is recreated every year, and people of all ages pin red carnations to their lapels as a sign of national pride and a reminder of the values that were won on that day. The songs of the revolution, E Depois do Adeus and Grândola Vila Morena, are played on the radio, and they have become the anthems of a free Portugal. The commemoration of the revolution is not just about parades and songs, it is also about reflection and education. Schools teach children about the events of April 25th, and museums, such as the Museu do Aljube in Lisbon, tell the story of the dictatorship and the struggle for freedom. These institutions serve a crucial role in ensuring that the memory of the Estado Novo and the sacrifices that were made to overthrow it are not forgotten. The holiday is a reminder that democracy is not a given, but a fragile and precious thing that must be constantly defended and nurtured. It is also a moment for the country to grapple with the more complex parts of its past, including the legacy of the colonial wars and the authoritarian regime. The holiday is a platform for open and honest discussion, a way for the country to continue its journey of self-discovery and reconciliation. The commemoration of the revolution is also a way for Portugal to project its values onto the international stage. The story of the Carnation Revolution is a powerful one, and the country is proud to share it with the world. On April 25th, reporters from all over the world come to Lisbon to cover the celebrations, and the story of the peaceful transition is told again and again. It is a powerful and inspiring example for other countries that are still struggling for freedom and democracy. The celebration is a testament to the fact that a single peaceful act can have a lasting and global impact. The commemoration of April 25th is a beautiful and important part of the national calendar, a day that celebrates not just a historical event, but a core part of the country's identity. The final and perhaps most enduring legacy of the Carnation Revolution is the transformation of the Portuguese people themselves. They had lived for so long under a system that demanded obedience and discouraged independent thought, and yet, when the moment came, they rose to the occasion with a grace and a determination that was truly remarkable. The revolution taught them and the world that a people could choose freedom and democracy without a long and bloody struggle. It showed that the will of the people was a far more powerful force than any army or any secret police. The Portuguese people, having lived in a political vacuum for so long, had to quickly learn the messy and sometimes frustrating art of democracy. They had to learn how to debate, how to compromise, and how to hold their leaders accountable. It was a difficult but necessary education, and they passed with flying colors. The country, once so isolated and backward, was now a vibrant and active member of the global community. The revolution's legacy is also a story of economic and social progress. The end of the colonial wars and the country's integration into the European Union unlocked a wave of economic development that had been stifled for decades. The country's infrastructure was modernized, its economy grew, and the quality of life for the average Portuguese citizen improved dramatically. The social gains of the revolution, such as the right to vote for all citizens, the right to form unions, and the establishment of a robust social security system, became a permanent part of the national fabric. The country had, in a sense, a long-delayed awakening, and it was a beautiful and peaceful one. The revolution's legacy is a testament to the power of a single, transformative event and the quiet, determined spirit of a people who had had enough. And so, The story of the Carnation Revolution and the end of the long, quiet era of the Estado Novo comes to a peaceful close. It is a story that reminds us that even in the most entrenched of dictatorships, the seeds of change can be sown, and that sometimes a revolution begins not with a bang, but with a whisper, and ends not with a fight, but with a flower. It is a story that will be told for generations to come, a powerful reminder that freedom and democracy are always possible, and that even the most fragile of things, a single red carnation, can change the course of history forever. The old regime, with all its dusty power and its silent authority, had simply faded away like a dream from long ago. The memory of it and the brave people who brought it to an end will remain, a quiet and comforting presence. The sun had set on one kind of Portugal, and it had risen on another, a new dawn that was bright with promise and filled with the gentle, quiet hope of a people who were finally and truly free. End of script. Sweet dreams.